Continue our spring author series. Tonight we welcome a woman who 5 years ago inherited an incredible gift from her Quaker American godmother. It's a treasure trove of over 5,000 vintage gowns. Her godmother, Doris Darnell, collected, with items ranging from a 200-year-old mended best dress to contemporary Dior and Chanel originals. And you can see here that the fashion alone was quite spectacular, but our guest today found that when she opened these boxes of dresses sent to her, she found something that made it even more incredibly special. Along with it came a collection of stories about the dresses, about the women who owned them, and about the moments in their lives that made these garments so very memorable. Our speaker has written these poignant, funny, and endearing stories into a truly stunning book that has a really awesome cover, I might add. Dreaming of Dior, by the way, illustrations by Grant Cowan. And we are so glad that she is here today to share these stories with us. She is the curator of the Fashion and Textile Gallery in Sydney, Australia, and is currently on a whirlwind book tour in the States, and we really couldn't be more thrilled that she's chosen Darien as one of the stops on her tour. We are so excited. Please join me in welcoming our guest for this evening, Ms. Charlotte Smith.
Thank you. So tell me if this is okay. Is it on, do you think?
Yeah, it's on.
Yep, okay. And thank you very much for having me here. I grew up in America, but I've lived overseas for so long now that coming back here is a real treat. And it's funny being in New York City, where I worked for 3 years when I had absolutely no money, and I had to do that thing of living in those hideous railroad kind of apartments that you sort of wonder if it was going to cave in one day. And now coming back and being treated by Simon & Schuster, staying in a really lovely hotel, having car and driver all the time. I mean, it's the way to go. It's going to be very difficult to get back on the plane and go economy class back to Sydney. But what I thought I'd do tonight is sort of tell a little history about how this collection came about, and how I got involved, and of course how it's completely and utterly changed my life. And then I thought I brought a selection of dresses, and I'll read a few stories and then give you some behind the scenes anecdotes and things that we didn't put in the book, so that you get a better understanding about some of these dresses. But really, to start off, I was born in Hong Kong, and my mother was English and my father's American. And after living in Hong Kong for about a year, I think my mother thought she was going to be there forever, because she enjoyed that sort of expat life over there. We came back to America and moved to Salem, Massachusetts, and then ended up living in Marblehead, and then moved down to Westchester, Pennsylvania, just near Philadelphia, where I pretty much grew up. And then I went to school at Hollins College in Roanoke, Virginia. So I had that real East Coast, upbringing. And as soon as I left Hollins, I then went to New York City, where I got a job working for Aquavella Galleries, which was at the time the leading gallery selling impressionist paintings and modern 20th century masters, and of course met everybody from the Duke of Marlborough to Mary Tyler Moore to Steve Martin, people like that. So I think that kind of was the beginning, really the beginning of the end for me, but the beginning of that kind of wonderful realizing that stories and meeting people and kind of going with the flow can really change your life. So I got there, lived there for about 3 years, and then one of my adventures includes some of the dresses that are here, but I was invited to a wedding in Monte Carlo, but I'll tell you about that later. And then, of course, that got me overseas, because I was offered a job in Monaco, and then ended up working in Monaco, working in Paris, and then ending up in London. And it was when I was living in England that I heard through the grapevine, and literally out of the blue, that my godmother was going to leave me her clothing collection. Now, to start again with the story, so that Doris is included, of course Doris was a very big part of my life from obviously day one. She was my godmother, but when we moved, and even moved to Massachusetts, I didn't see her much. And of course it took me until I was about 6 years old to actually realize that Doris, my godmother, was a real person. And the moment she became that real person in a child's mind was when we arrived on Christmas Eve. It was snowing, and if anyone knows Philadelphia, she lives in the historic part of Philadelphia, and in those wonderful brick federal townhouses with the cobbled streets going down, and snow was coming down, and I remember knocking on the front door to say that we were there, and Doris arrived, opened the door and greeted us. And Doris she was the most wonderful woman, very tall, very dramatic, and didn't care that she was wearing some extraordinary vintage outfit, which of course I didn't know what vintage was at the time, but she lived for it, and she swung the door back, and I remember just looking up and thinking, wow, she was wearing this fabulous black silk bustle skirt, and if you know the shape of the bustle skirt, you've got that wonderful sort of bump at the back, and Doris decided not to go that far and not wear the bustle underneath. So of course that skirt had all that extra fabric, so she had this wonderful train that fell to the ground. And then she was wearing this Edwardian white cotton long sleeve top with this wonderful sort of neck with all the lace around it, and then she'd put a sprig of holly on the neck, and her hair was swept up in this beautiful chignon that she always used to wear. So that was really, and I was about 6, and that was really the first moment that I knew that Doris was Doris, and she was quite extraordinary. And the treat was that Doris's collection began innocently, because I don't know whether anyone's Quaker, and I'm not Quaker, but we certainly grew up in a sort of Quaker community because all of my parents' friends were Quaker. But Quakers are not meant to be interested in fashion. Clothing is meant to be worn, it's meant to be practical and functional, but to wear the latest fashion is just not meant to be a priority. And collecting is not meant to be part of a Quaker, a good practicing Quaker's life, because of course collecting really means that you're coveting, and coveting again is something that is sort of a no-no. So Doris always said, she always claimed that she was a maverick, and she said the reason she got around it was not only because she was Doris and could get around most things that she wanted to in the nicest possible way, but she also said that what she was doing was that by wearing a lot of the clothing that she was given, which was the big point. She didn't go out and buy it, she was given it. That she was actually preserving people's stories and their histories. Because one of the things Doris was passionate about was she was a passionate letter writer, which hence why I have these wonderful notes about the women and their dresses. But what she would do is someone would give her something, and then she'd sit down maybe over a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and she would write down by hand, of course, back then, and talk about these things that these women would pass on to her. And so a lot of the stories that are in the book, we've changed the name slightly, because I suddenly thought, as I would write down the real person's name, that there might have been that moment when someone was handing over something, especially like the lingerie outfit that we'll talk about in a minute. And, they might have been telling Doris things that really were quite intimate secrets that they might not have told anybody else. And there's actually, I'm working on book 2. I've actually written book 2 now, which is a sequel to this one. And there's a story in there about a dress, and there's so many stories, it's quite unbelievable how much I have to use as my reference. But there's a story about a woman, and this is something that really hit home to me, was that when they were clearing the mother's house after she'd passed away, they found this box tucked in the corner up in the attic, a lovely box, and inside they found this beautiful pink chiffon beaded 1920s dress. And it was all wrapped up in tissue, and obviously had been lovingly placed there and not opened for many, many years. And the two daughters, had no idea this dress even existed, and it's absolutely exquisite. And they sort of wondered. Their mother was a nurse all her life and led, a good but practical working life, and never had any sort of glamour like that in her life. And this is a seriously glamorous, and it's actually sort of that flapper period. And what was so lovely was in the notes that I got from Doris, the daughters were saying, wasn't it wonderful that their mother had gone to the grave with this delicious secret? And so, now looking at that story, I realized probably how many stories were told to Doris that when they never ever in a million years imagined that there would be a book that's now being published on both sides of the world about their stories. So I take it with respect that a lot of the stories in there were probably meant to be just between Doris and the person giving them. But what I've found, of course, that Doris didn't know what she was doing this unintentionally, but what we have is this fantastic recording of social history. And fashion has never played such an important role, because we can watch how women's lives have changed through each decade. And my clothing collection, which I'll tell you about a bit in a minute, is probably the first earliest dress is 1820. And it's a wonderful Quaker wedding dress, and the bride was married in Nantucket. And you know, what we're looking at is what was important in women's lives in these different decades, and how something that we write about now, about, you know, someone who was a singer, and when she'd hear birdsong, which is one of the dresses here, she'd go to the piano and play. I mean, that was back in the 50s. Now that's something in 2010 that kind of wouldn't really register as being important enough to even tell someone, let alone, you know, acknowledge that it was important in your life. And also what we can look at through the notes that Doris saved, and through the dresses and the different silhouettes and styles that were changing, you know, we can look at how women were changing the way they perceived themselves and their roles in society, and how the way their roles were changing meant that fashion had to adapt to that changing role so that they could do it. And I mean, as basic as, you know, those huge crinolines and bustles that women wore in the 1800s. You know, if you are playing tennis, which they did, you know, as early as sort of, you know, the 1900s or 1910, and certainly from 1920s onwards, you couldn't do it. And also how the diets changed. And of course, if you're strapped into something incredibly tight, like a corset with all the bits underneath, you know, you can't eat certain things. So, you know, for me, you know, what Doris was doing was, by collecting these clothes from people, and everything was given to her, she was really forming a very important base for us to understand fashion history. And that's something that, you know, my collection now, and I'm really just a custodian of this collection, it's the largest private collection in Australasia, because there are huge clothing collections in Australia, nothing like you have here. I mean, you know, what we have over there is quite, you know, paltry, but we do have some fabulous things, but they are all in museums. And as soon as you have something in a museum, everything has to be done by bureaucracy and protocol and rules and regulations. And what I've done with Doris's collection is continuing what Doris has always believed in, that these dresses and this collection is going to continue to grow, and it's a living collection. And you know, I go out and I can bring 12 or 14 dresses with me to America to do a talk, because, you know, I don't have to tick a box saying, you know, is it going to be a controlled atmosphere, or you're not going to fold them, and all this sort of stuff. And so with Doris, you see, you know, I'm continuing what she's doing, and I'm now being given enormous amounts of things. So when I heard, well, when I was growing up, you know, Doris always had this third floor that was filled with these fabulous treasures. And so we trot upstairs to the third floor, and it was one of those pitched roof kind of third floors where under the eaves there would be pushed, you know, a chest of drawers, so that you'd pull open a drawer and out would spring, you know, sort of 500 gloves that Doris had kind of squished down to keep them inside. And you'd have stacks of hat boxes, and you'd have, you know, big huge bins with umbrellas in it, or parasols in it. And then she had that really lovely old-fashioned kind of wardrobes with the plate glass, so that when you slid them back, the real 60s look, you know, out would sort of tumble. And I honestly mean this. I just remember these dresses kind of falling off their hangers, because she had so many in the cupboards, and they were sequin ones, or ones with, you know, fabulous marabou feather collars, or, you know, something that might have some wonderful sort of poochy pattern on them. So it was absolutely magical. And every time I'd visit her, which of course was, you know, quite regularly, because Philadelphia was so close to us, and then when I was sort of a teenager, she'd asked me to be a model in her talks, because she would do a lot of talks for charities and things, and I would go up and model, and you know, she'd always take me up and show me the latest thing, or hand me something. And you know, I have to say, I'm very ashamed to admit this, but back then all I wanted were new clothes. I wanted the latest look. I wanted, you know, the short skirts. I wanted, you know, something that came from, I don't know, Mostellers or Strawbridge and Clothier or whatever it was. And I was not impressed that, you know, she'd invite me to dress up in something, and I'd sort of look at it and, you know, pray that none of my friends were, you know, going to see me dressed up in some Edwardian outfit that, you know, I could hardly walk in. So in a way, you know, my appreciation of what Doris collected has only come late in life. So I feel very, you know, so that's why I'm probably so passionate about it now. But with Doris, she, like I say, everything was given to her. And, you know, with these wonderful stories coming to her, and of course when you buy things, it's rare that you get the story with it. So she was given everything, and when the part of the collection I got is the second half of her collection. The first half was probably about 2,000 or 3,000 pieces, and that was given to Shippensburg State for their fashion archive department. And, you know, I have to say, you know, without sounding incredibly greedy, you know, I look through the list of what's gone to the fashion archives and I think, oh, you know, can you imagine? I mean, some of them really were quite spectacular. But what I got was when she retired in 1974 and 1975, she was secretary for the Society of Friends, so the Quaker organization. She devoted herself to the collection, and she was invited to give talks, including talks on the QE2. And when she went on these major cruise ships, of course, all these very wealthy, lovely ladies would come to her fashion talks, and afterwards would come up and say, well, you know, I've got 4 Dior's, or I've got, you know, Madeleine Vionnet as my debutante dress in the 1930s, would you like them? So what I actually was bequeathed was the, you know, the phenomenal designer section of it, plus I got a lot of Doris's favorites. So I had about 3,500 pieces arrive by Qantas. Qantas is my best friend because great things arrive or go with Qantas, and they arrived in 70 boxes. And when I first heard that I was inheriting this collection, you know, I had a young daughter at the time, 4 years old. I had an antique shop. I thought I was really busy, and boy, you know, do I think back to those days and think that was not busy. And, you know, my husband at the time wasn't well. And so suddenly I hear I'm inheriting Doris's collection. And of course, because I'd been out of America for so long, I had no idea how spectacular it was. And, you know, I thought I might be getting sort of a bunch of dresses, you know, flowery, maybe a few polyester numbers from the 1950s, and wasn't quite as excited or, you know, anticipating the arrival of these dresses. And when they did arrive, I cleared out what I thought was ample space in my shop. And, you know, this truck arrived, and, you know, there was this huge pallet on the back of this truck with all these boxes, and I'm sort of thinking, you know, uh-oh. And so we're quickly pushing furniture farther in front of the shop so that I could make sure I had room. And of course, you know, we were stacking boxes from floor to ceiling. And the other thing I said to myself, because all my friends, and including now my ex-husband, still a very good friend now that he sees that this is working, you know, he's coming around to help me with it. But at the time, he was horrified. And all he said to me, it's not coming home. So I had to spend my whole time figuring out what I was going to do with this. And I thought, well, what I'll do is, because I don't know what it is, I will just keep it stacked up, put it into storage, and think about it next year when my life sort of settles down. And of course, you know, like Pandora, and I thought, oh, I'll just open one box. And of course, you know, I ripped back, and this is one of the stories, I think I wrote about it in the beginning of the book, but I tore the tape off one of these boxes, and we're talking about a box that, you know, stands about that tall, like that. And I pull the tape off, and, you know, all this tissue paper comes floating out, and I pull out one dress, and it's a 1920s sort of cream chiffon dress with these fabulous glass beads that go down the front with this wonderful kind of, you know, floaty skirt or hem. So I pull it out, I'm like, oh, that's nice, thinking, well, it's not polyester and it's not flowery in 1950s. And then the next thing I pull out is a dress that had a little tag on it saying worn when Elizabeth Harvey was presented to Queen Victoria in 1867. And I'm thinking, okay, this is, you know, this is looking a little bit worrying, because I'm realizing, and it went on. It took me 3 months, because of course I couldn't stop at one box. So it took me 3 months to go through every box, because what Doris and Howard's still alive and he'd be in his late 90s by now, was that they had wrapped each individual dress or bodice or petticoat or whatever it was in cotton, and I've got the most incredible vintage cotton sheet collection now, and pillowcase collection, because everything was wrapped up in things like that. And so in each box I would get up to 30 dresses. And it was just, and there was one day I remember, I suddenly had more girlfriends than I'd ever knew that lived in Blackheath, you see, where I live in the Blue Mountains in Australia. And, you know, they were all coming in, and it turned into sort of the girls' coffee morning, and we'd sort of sit around and they'd all look at what had, you know, most recently come out of a box. And I never forget, and it sounds so decadent, and it really was, but I had this lovely shop with huge glass windows, and of course the sun would come in at certain parts of the day, and we're all sitting around and I just opened, you know, a third box after, you know, saying I wouldn't open anymore. And I had literally a mound of dresses next to, you know, in the circle around with my friends sitting around, and they were sort of sequiny ones, there were beaded ones, there were flowery ones, and it was literally a mound, and the light was coming in. I'll just never forget sort of the sparkling coming off the dress, and I'm just thinking, you know, it's sort of like Aladdin's cave. It's sort of too good to be true. But you know what came with knowing that what I got, and then of course the Dior's came out and things like that, was that I suddenly realized this was not something you were going to shut in a damp garage for a year and expect to find okay, you know, later on in the future. So I suddenly realized that what I had was something that really required instant attention. So I was offered space. So I unpacked everything. It took a year, and within a year, I of course found every dress. I found the huge volumes of notes. I have all the letters that people wrote Doris saying, you know, I'm so glad, you know, you love Aunt Pat's, you know, ermine cape or something like that. So I have all these letters. And then I also, because my mother had recently passed away, I found huge boxes of letters that came in with all the furniture I inherited from my mother in drawers that I'd never ever opened at my mother's house. Drawers of letters that Doris and my mother had been writing since 1954. And in that I found more wonderful stories about things that my mother had bought Doris when we were living in Hong Kong, or things. So I had this incredible sort of it was like a diary of all these different women, and some of them were very, very short stories, and other ones were pages long, and, you know, wonderful letters. And there's a wonderful letter in there, I didn't bring that outfit, of Doris writing my godmother, Doris writing my mother when she was in Hong Kong, you know, just talking about things that we just don't talk about, but very specifically talking about a certain outfit she wore. So anyway, so, you know, in Australia, fashion, it's very much a man's world in Australia, and fashion really didn't take off until maybe about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, because of course some of our designers are now internationally renowned, and so fashion has become the, you know, the government has realized, and people realize that fashion actually brings in money. So suddenly fashion is something that you can talk about without people looking at you like you're a bit mad. And it took me a number of years to realize, to figure out what I could do with this collection. Because one of the things that was always instilled in me, and of course, you know, Doris was still alive. I mean, I knew I could not sell the collection. And as tempting as it might have been, even though not for me it wasn't, but, you know, for my husband at the time, he was very tempted to, you know, sell it, and then we could just kind of, you know, live comfortably for the rest of our lives. But you know, I couldn't sell it, so I'm trying to think, you know, what do I do with a collection this big? And so in the end, I started traveling around, doing exhibitions and talks for different charity groups. I did a lot of work with the National Trust, and the stories and what the exhibitions were about, you know, people started to write about them. And you know, I knew what I had was really special, but I just couldn't find that niche. And then I did something for the National Gallery in Victoria, and I started working with a lot of students, fashion students, and I suddenly realized that that could be a wonderful opportunity of working with students. And then, of course, now it's turned into the movie industry and the Opera Australia and people like that, who have never had that resource to go look at, to find out how a bodice was made in the 1950s, or how putting a crinoline on in a dress in the 1860s and 1870s could alter the shape, and, you know, all that sort of stuff. So I suddenly realized that that was the direction to go. And so in between all this, I get an email from HarperCollins saying that they had been watching my story for the past year, and they felt that there was a story in my story. So that was about 2 years ago, and so that's how the book evolved. And I did an interview this morning on Martha Stewart Living, on her radio program, and you know, I was saying that, I mean, all this has just happened. It's just sort of fallen into my lap, and, you know, I've sort of done what I had always wanted to do, or, you know, sort of envisaged making the collection sort of known and respected for the, you know, for the standard that it really is. And I was saying that I know that there are so many writers out there who have fabulous books and have never found that agent or that publisher. And, you know, the way I got a book deal was, you know, probably sort of the dream come true, because they approach me, and as soon as they approach you, things are different, you know, then they really work hard and they try to work it out. So we got this book up and running. And And Doris never knew about the book, but her husband is still alive, Howard, and so he knows all about the book, and I think he's probably the biggest purchaser of the book to date. I mean, he's bought it for everybody he knows. But what's really lovely is that Doris's story obviously lives on, and all the people who gave her these things in love and in trust, is how she's always said it, their stories live on. And now what's happening with me is that I'm given more. I've been given at least another 2,000 pieces. And they include, I do quite a bit of television work in Australia, and the first show I ever did, a woman was watching, and she knew she didn't have long to live, and she had been collecting for many, many years. And she said to her husband, will you ensure that my collection goes someplace where it will be, kept and continued and cherished like I had it. And so I got an email from ABC television in Australia saying that this person would like to contact you. And so the husband wrote me, and in the end I had to rent a truck to go down to Adelaide to go pick this collection up. It was absolutely vast, and that was another 600 pieces. And then the most recent thing I've had is that Australia, because it promotes and exports merino wool. I've done a lot of work with the Australian Wool Innovations, and they have this incredible archive of contemporary Australian designers who use wool to create something. And so I got 75 pieces from them, and they include Woolmark award winners from Paris in 2008. They include people like Akira Isagawa, who, I don't know whether you know him, but he's, always used wool. I've got Tina Cavallis, Michelle Jank, unbelievable Australian designers. And what's wonderful is that, they understand, now my commitment to Doris's collection, and they love the philosophy of Doris's collection. And so instead of giving it to the Powerhouse Museum, which is our big museum in Sydney, which has clothing, or the National Gallery of Victoria that has huge clothing, they chose to give it to the Darnell collection, which is what I go under, so that, and as a reward, but it wasn't intentional, they're going into the next book, and it just shows you how this collection is just continuing to grow, and it's always living. And I always say that it's an museum, because I have my exhibitions, but people can get up close and personal as long as they don't touch, and they can look at how a hem's been done. And that's something else that I was telling Parsons School of Design, because I did a talk for them the other day, was that I'm probably the only person probably in the world who works with fashion students and works with fashion, and I can't even sew a button on an outfit. And so when I went to Parsons, the green suit, we'll have to remember I think it was Tess who did it, the button was coming off, and so she very kindly sewed it on for me, because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do it. So, but I always say to everybody, that it just shows you that fashion is, you don't have to be a fashion designer to be in fashion. You don't have to know how to sew, because there's so many different angles in fashion. You've got fashion history, fashion business, and anything like that. So I sort of take on the role as curator and ambassador of fashion, really, and I go around and talk about it and things like that. But anyway, I've talked way too much now, and I better get to some stories. But when we were working on this book, one of my colleagues at a French fashion school I was working for at the time, he did the most wonderful illustrations. And so, we sort of figured out a way that, he could be put up there along with all the illustrators that HarperCollins was trying to promote to get the job. And, he absolutely got the job hands down, because what we wanted was an illustrator who didn't have a style that everyone recognized right away, because the thing that's really important about illustrations is that they're unique to either your book or whatever it is you're trying to convey. And so Grant, being really young, 26, he hadn't established a look yet. So with Grant that we've created, all the women they're all glamorous, and they're all incredibly thin and beautifully curvaceous and everything else you need to do. But, it's not a look that you've seen before. And the reason we chose illustrations, and this is a question I get asked a lot, rather than photographs, is that this book is it's meant to be, a bit nostalgic, a bit about, past sort of genteel decades and periods in fashion history. And for me, as soon as you see a photograph, to me that absolutely kills any sort of imagination you can put into it. You look at all the detail for the detail, you look at it, there's nothing you can miss. Whereas with an illustration, although you're not getting to see the wonderful detail of the real dress, you actually can envisage some of these things seeing them in the illustration, and imagine yourself wearing them, or imagine the woman wearing them. And we also wanted to make sure that storytelling element was really strong. And again, once you have a photograph, there's no story anymore. You're just looking at a photograph. And I got asked by the Los Angeles Times to why I was using illustrations versus photographs. And I think they were trying to test it out to see whether, they were going to do a story on it. And I said to them that, we're in this age now, and it's really not going to change unless people make a concerted effort, where everything we need is a spontaneous press of a button. Anything we want to know is there, any photograph, any graph, directions, whatever. And we've lost that wonderful elegance of writing. So, nobody knows how to do longer than a Twitter sentence or whatever it is. And so we've lost that wonderful art of writing and that wonderful opportunity of still daydreaming or dreaming about something and not having that instant fact right there in your face. And that was the other thing. So I wanted to keep that real storytelling. And one day there'll be another book that will be photographs, but that will be a research book rather than more of a storytelling book. So what I thought, I'm sure I've forgotten lots of things to tell you. So afterwards, think of any questions and I'd be happy to answer them and be a bit less vague about how this whole thing happened. But, this whole experience, it's such an incredible adventure. And, I'm always saying to people that, I am just an ordinary woman who's had the most extraordinary opportunities. And I've met incredible people in my life. And don't ask me why. I guess it's the right time, the right place at the right time. So, this whole thing has kind of just happened, and it's turned into a juggernaut now. And, my life, some days I don't even know, like now, but it could be a bit, having flown from the other side of the world, I have no idea what day it is. I sort of look at my diary and I'm like, right, and I look down the list and then I think, oh, is it Wednesday or whatever? Anyway, so it's very exciting, and I'm enjoying every opportunity, and, of course, coming to speak and telling Doris's story and the collection's story. But what I'll do is I'll just grab dresses down, and maybe some of them I'll read a little bit from the book that we wrote about, and then other ones I might tell you a bit more history about the dress of the period. But this one here is 1960s, and lovely sort of silk chiffon dress, I'm sure. This is something, of course, that I could wear now. And, I'm sure many people remember wearing lovely dresses like that. Your real sort of cocktail kind of a dress. And the story behind this, I'll just read this one because it's short. But what I wrote was, made for misbehaving, this 1960s cobalt blue chiffon cocktail dress with a sequin collar was the perfect choice for the guest of honor at a glamorous party to mark a landmark birthday. The celebration went into the wee hours and beyond, helped along by a glittering circle of friends, including Princess Grace of Monaco, and plenty of French champagne. But with a dress like this and a few little birthday jewels from Cartier, the birthday girl was assured center stage. After all, it's not every day a gal gets to celebrate turning 80. And so, it's suddenly you look at this dress and it's like, wow, it has a different meaning now. We all looked at it because it was a beautiful dress in the 60s. And then suddenly you can imagine how elegant this woman would have been, and, in Monte Carlo wearing a fabulous dress like that. So this one, it's getting a little bit sort of fragile. So I'm only bringing it out occasionally now. And once we've finished, I've finished this book tour, I'll take it back, and it will have to be very delicately dry cleaned and then put into one of those protective boxes. And that's something else too, that when I had to choose these dresses, how do you choose from 142 dresses? But I decided to bring things that I felt could survive being packed in and out of a suitcase, do the trip and all that, and then could be dry cleaned. Many things now, of course, you just can't dry clean, and anything you can, at least you know that you can use for sort of special occasions like this. Now this one is your classic little black Dior dress. So really special, and I have to say, in the collection I've got wonderful couture clothing, and it's everything from Dior's. This one actually was worn or put on parade in 1960 for the spring-summer collection in Paris. And I've got, beautiful, I've got a beautiful ball gown that's, one of those ones absolutely fitted around the waist with a corset that Dior had constructed inside the gown. So that one's probably about 1948 with a wonderful full skirt. And then I've got another black dress with a classic big stuffed panels over the hip, probably made of some sort of horsehair and some sort of wool padding. So you get that wonderful round hip figure, even if you didn't have it. So Dior would be the person for me, because I have an absolutely straight figure. So you see, I could even put a Dior jacket on and suddenly have wonderful curves. I think my pocketbook wouldn't cope with that. But this one's wonderful because, you know, it's just one of those symbolic dresses. And when I was at Holland's, I did that year abroad, Paris year abroad, and of course Doris thought this was an incredible opportunity. I mean, I was penniless, of course, in Paris, but Doris sent me over with a suitcase full of fantastic, you know, vintage dresses, and something like, so this was in the 80s, or late 70s, so early 80s, so of course, you know, I could still get away with wearing something like this, and this was just one of those dresses that whenever I was invited out by, you know, some dashing Frenchman, you know, I just throw that on, and, you know, it's the type of thing that if you were overdressed, you just quickly put a shawl over you so you just looked normal, and if you suddenly had to be super glamorous, you just turn around with your shawl off and, you know, just really make sure that your back was visible with that lovely, and that's what's so fabulous about this dress, because when you look at it from the front, you think, oh, how sweet, and then you turn around and you think, wow, you know, fabulous V, but with that cute little girly bow on the back. So that dress, you know, didn't have any specific kind of stories, but it was just one of those, you know, fallback dresses, and of course, again, you know, back in the 70s when I wasn't really appreciating what I had, you know, I mean, you know, of course, now I think, can you imagine being, you know, 19 and having a little black Dior dress in your sort of suitcase that you pull out whenever you needed that extra special outfit. So I love my Diors, I have to say. And, you know, again, with these designers, I have, I've got Madeleine Vionnet. I don't know whether you are familiar with her, but she was a designer from the 30s who really revolutionized fashion design, because she was the first one to cut fabric on a bias. So she was the one who got all that beautiful silk crepe and jersey, the really kind of elasticy kind of fabrics, and cut it so that her dresses were like second skins, and, you know, absolutely really spectacular. So I've got three of hers. I've got people like Lucille Lady Duff Gordon, who was a designer in the Edwardian period, and, you know, she did these, she always called her dresses gowns of emotion, so you can imagine how girly and over the top and, you know, decadent they were. And then I've got, you know, Pucci, I've got Jean Muir, I've got Missoni, I've got Armani, I've got Dolce & Gabbana. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So I've really got a wonderful range of designers through the different decades. And one of my goals is, you know, once I get, you know, raise the kind of finances I need to really get my, oh, that's the other thing, I'm trying to set up the Australian Fashion Resource Centre so that it is a home for it in Sydney. So one of my goals, once I get the Fashion Resource Centre up and running, is to buy one garment or have it given, if we know the people who have those things, of every prominent designer in each century, or have one iconic look from each decade, so that we have that wonderful reference through the years. Anyway, so this dress here was part of my Monte Carlo story, and this is another 1950s gown. And absolutely, you know, it's very dreamy, because it's sort of, you know, just the slightest sort of breeze and the whole thing is sort of, you know, flowing around you. But this was another one. This was when I was working for Aquavella Galleries. I heard my friend, my best friend at the time, said that she'd just been invited to a wedding in Monaco, and, you know, being brash and, you know, rude, I'm sure, I insisted that I get invited too, because I just thought there is no way I'm missing a wedding in Monaco. And so I did get invited, because obviously they probably needed a few more Americans over there to bump up the groom's side of the contingent. So I flew over and, of course, called Doris and said, Doris, help, you know, I need, because there were parties every single night, because the bride's father was Prince Renier's, you know, sort of right-hand man. And so it was going to be very formal, so I had to have different outfits for every night. So this one is the one I wore, that they had their wedding as they do on the Friday, just a civil ceremony. And then they had the huge reception on the Saturday night. And that was on the wonderful veranda of the Hotel de Paris in Monte Carlo. So you look straight out over the ocean. And of course, you know, as you do, you meet a prince. And so I then had the next 5 days, you know, driving around in Prince Albert's Porsche, which was very exciting, you know, wearing all these fantastic clothes. So this dress is very, very special, because I just remember it was one of those once-in-a-lifetime opportunities of, almost being there. It was wonderful having that, and it was just so social. So then that's sort of your 1950s, and that one's lovely too, because they've done this very unusual. They have this sort of pannier on the hips, so that the skirt, because it's tied around the bodice with these sort of horsehair panniers here, the whole thing just comes out in this wonderful shape. It's just so simple, and yet the dress's silhouette is just created so perfectly by sort of construction like that. Now this one here I brought, where is it? Because I'm doing a talk in Philadelphia. Now this one's sort of late 60s, early 70s, and part of the stories in the book, there's sort of wonderful romantic stories, and there's some, some that are where it's heartbreak, and others that are funny and misadventure and everything. And then there are a few of the other ones where, you always remember wearing something that probably wasn't very suitable at the time, but you didn't realize it until many, many years later, and this is one of them. But when I was at school in Paris, my father was working at the Philadelphia Art Museum, and I'm sure because he wanted to make sure that I was eating properly and not doing what I did to get this dress of not eating so I could save all my French francs to go out and buy something, he asked the curator of fashion and textiles, a man by the name of Das Cavallo, if he would take me out to lunch. And I knew I had to impress Mr. Cavallo, and I had to be absolutely on my best behavior and best manners and whatever. And so I was trying to find something really practical to wear to lunch. And I decided to wear this. And I thought, well, that, I was really going to impress him. And he was so polite, and I'll never forget, I walk in and you could just see his face sort of, I sort of sparkled my whole way into this, and it was one of those really posh restaurants right near the Parc de Monceau. And, everyone else was in some sort of, lovely dark power suit. And I walked in this, with probably matching pink shoes. I can actually remember what shoes I wore. And he very politely didn't say a word and went home and told my father that I was, very well behaved, and, he should be very proud, but he didn't tell Dad that I'd worn that. But it's one thing that's really special about this dress is that it's all, the beads obviously, or the sequins, have all been hand stitched on, but it's been stitched onto the most wonderful soft wool kind of mesh backing. And whenever you get sequiny things now, unless you're paying huge amounts of money, they tend to be put on some sort of synthetic kind of backing, which means that not only does it hang differently, but it's not quite so comfortable. So, wearing this, it's like wearing some beautiful woolly jumper, but you happen to sparkle every time you hit the sunlight. So I love the dress, and I do wear this occasionally, to functions. So it's got another, and all this stuff is in fashion now. I don't know where we always wear sequins like that, but certainly, that sort of shape and style. It's not like I've chosen something that looks like it's Victorian. Let's see, I'll choose, this one is quite a lovely one. This one's 1960s, late 1960s, because of course what was happening in the 60s was that the Dior, that new look, was very much a part of the fashion till probably about almost 1966, 1967. And then suddenly you had this instant change, so that they called it the youthquake. And so suddenly you had the young people dictating what the fashion styles were going to be, and everything went from being, very sort of, not quite middle-aged, but, being quite demure with the big puffed and the tight corsets to, micro mini skirts and go-go boots and, sort of funky tights and things like that. But this one is quite a lovely one. This is by a Paris-trained designer called Guy Mullier, who ended up going to Caracas to set up his practice. And Doris's family there, I haven't seen them in years, and quite a few of them are coming to the Philadelphia talk, but her eldest son, Eric, and it just makes me laugh now, because obviously everything was destined. I was definitely destined to be in Australia. There was that connection somehow, and I didn't realize it, because Doris and her lovely clothes, and always dressing up and going to the supermarket wearing boa, sort of shawls and some sort of Edwardian hat with something, and her son ends up being he preferred living rurally in Vermont, and he was the world boomerang champion. And, you know, and of all things that, you know, I end up in Australia, but, you know, this wonderful, but he married a woman by the name of Chesley Larson, who came from a very wealthy family that had been based in Paris and then moved to Caracas. And her mother-in-law, she was married before, and her mother-in-law was quite shocked by the clothing that Chesley tended to wear. So she would take her out shopping, and their favorite place to go was the Guy Moulier Atelier in Caracas. So I've got some wonderful clothing from just from South America, and all very Paris-based. And it just shows how designers tended to go to areas where they knew that they would have good customers, and they would set up shops. They didn't always base themselves in Paris or in London. They would actually go out looking for areas where they knew that they would be the only ones making something, and obviously do very well business-wise. Let's see. Oh, this is a nice story. I'll read this one. This one is another. It's sort of probably late 50s, and it's you know, that sort of kind of wiggle dress style. So even though in the 50s you had those wonderful puff skirts and the wonderful tight bodices, you also had the ones that actually you really had to wiggle to get them down over your body. So this is one of these wiggle dresses, and it's really unusual, although you see it now, but this was one of the first times they did it, where they would take silk ribbon and with a machine sew it on, but a hand was moving it, so that's why you get that wonderful kind of, you know, carefree pattern on it. But again, it was put onto a wool backing, and that's the quality in these dresses. And then these wonderful panels along the top, it's all silk organdy, so a stiffened silk, so, you know, beautiful quality dress. But this story, Alice, better known as AJ, was a Bryn Mawr classmate Doris remembers fondly as a true maverick who looked at the world with humorous and sometimes cockeyed glasses. And a lot of these comments that I've made in here, that when you read it, you'll see they're in parentheses or in quotes. They are taken straight from the notes that Doris put down. So I tried to incorporate a lot of what Doris said into the notes. AJ was extremely beautiful, lovely to look at, with bright red hair. And again, this is straight from Doris's notes. With bright red hair, bright blue eyes, a glowing complexion, and a kind of Mae West figure. And her clothes were always beautiful, like this peach silk ribbon wiggle dress she wore in the 1950s. Doris loved that AJ lived to break convention, even small ones, like wearing ankle socks with high heels. The former were customary at college, but wearing them with high heels was considered beyond the pale. When the girls graduated, Doris received 3 treasured books from her parents. AJ's very wealthy parents fought over what to give her, and her father finally settled on a convertible. Her mother was so jealous that she'd been outdone that she took one of AJ's delicate diamond rings and traded it in for a much larger emerald-cut diamond, as you do. And the thing more about AJ's family was that they were so wealthy that they lived in a hotel. They had their own floor in one of the hotels in Philadelphia. And AJ's mother never in her life cooked a meal. She didn't even know how to make a sandwich. So they were fed by the hotel staff. And AJ lived this extraordinary life that, again, it just doesn't happen anymore. I mean, I know that there are very, very wealthy people out there, but just that kind of, it just doesn't happen. So it's wonderful to think that, and I've got a lot of AJ's clothes, and what's funny about them, they're all absolutely gorgeous, absolutely top quality. But I always imagine her wearing these beautiful dresses with those bobby socks and her shoes. So kind of the look there is a bit odd, but you can imagine what a fun person she was. Now this dress here is again 1950s, and what I love about this dress, and certainly about Doris's stories, are that some of the stories are just, they're just sort of really quite trivial, but they're quite sort of endearing because they are so trivial. And this one, the story goes on this one. Kathleen Price was a woman of many talents, not the least of which was an eye for style. She adored ballroom dancing and designed her dresses with dancing in mind, even her day dresses, which she didn't make this one, but this is one that apparently she used for a lot of her ideas. A 1950s original by Miami designer David Roth with a gloriously full skirt of navy blue broderie anglaise over dusty pink silk is a case in point. As Doris rightly describes it, a flirtatious dress, because you can imagine when she was spinning around, the wonderful skirt would be coming up around her. Well, Kathleen made many fabulous dresses for herself and Doris over the years. She loved combing the great stores in Los Angeles and San Francisco, like I. Magnin and Company and the White House, for finds like this. Kathleen was also a voracious reader and witty letter writer, and I have tons of her letters. But her real gift was singing, and she had perfect pitch. She could sing everything from show tunes to operatic arias by Bizet, Mozart, Puccini, and Wagner. Doris recalled that Kathleen would sometimes go to the piano to check a bird's pitch and follow with a spontaneous imitation of the song, which really, in the scheme of life, really is not really wildly exciting, but suddenly this dress, you know, it just kind of gives it a little bit more personality, and you can imagine what a lovely woman this woman was, and especially when you see a dress like this. I mean, it's not sort of, you know, overpoweringly outrageous or seductive or sexy, but it's just a really elegant dress. I'm probably talking too much, so I'll move on to a couple more good stories here, and then we'll do some question and answers. But this one here, I have to just talk about this one, because talk about wearing something, you know, once and having it being such an appropriate time to wear it. But this is another designer, like my dress is by a Philadelphia designer called Anne Pacraduni, and this is a suit of hers, and this is sort of 1970s. And what's great about it is that the trousers are completely see-through. There's no lining. They're completely see-through. But when you put the jacket over top of it, it covers over anything that might be seen. And what's really clever is that, of course, when your leg goes in there, it's actually the same color as the lining. So it was really cleverly done, so that you've got the lining, so that really, for somebody who thought that they were going to see something really exciting, you know, they would be fooled for quite a while. So, but what was fun about this was that when I was living in London, I was working for an art dealer, and I had, you know, again, no money. I was paid nothing, even though he was selling, you know, his paintings for millions and millions of dollars. And so any invitation to a party you would accept, you know, because he knew it meant free drink and free food. And so I was invited by some people I didn't really know to go to this party near to the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. And, you know, I'd had this suit. I think I'd gone back to America, and Doris had given it to me as a present. So, you know, I thought, it was a summer's night, I thought, well, I'll wear it. And so I put it on, and, you know, it's kind of groovy back then in the 1970s, and I'm sure my friends were wearing something equally outrageous. And I remember we walked into this party, and as I walked in, everything was white. The carpet was, you know, sort of shag pile carpeting, pure white. All the walls were white, and all the furniture was white leather furniture. And then I saw these three guys sitting on the sofa dressed in white pantsuits, and it was the Bee Gees. And the classic thing was that, of course, the guy with the fluffy hair, Barry or whatever, he was checking my suit out, and I thought, well, if I'd been a man, he probably would have come up and made some deal, like, you know, I'll swap suits with you or something. But anyway, I've never worn it since, and I just thought, I mean, if I hadn't worn it, I would have kicked myself for the rest of my life that I had a white suit, and I could have, you know, met the Bee Gees wearing my white suit. But I'll just do one more. I'll do this one. This one is a 1920s wedding dress, and it was worn by a woman, and this was another thing that's so lovely about this, Doris's notes and the stories, is that you get these fantastic names. Like the woman who wore this was called Olive Zug. You know, so Olive Zug wore this dress, and you know what's lovely about it, a lot of the dresses from the, you know, certainly the 20s and earlier, you have to wear a slip underneath, and if it was made by a designer, the designer's name would be in the slip. It wouldn't be on the dress, so we have no idea who made it. But it's absolutely beautiful, and it's, you know, again, the silk organdy, which is that stiffened silk, and, you know, these wonderful glass beads, and all these, you know, fabulous details, like these wonderful beads that, and you can imagine, you see, that she would have worn this, and apparently it caused a bit of outrage at the wedding because her father had died only a few weeks earlier, and it was at Christmas, and so everyone felt that out of respect for her father, she shouldn't get married, she should postpone the wedding or wear something a little bit more appropriate. And, you know, Olive decided, even with a name like Olive, she knew what she wanted. She said, I am going to get married. So she did get married because she knew that her father had been with her when they went and had the dress made. But what's really interesting about it is that The hem here, well, when you look at it, you see these wonderful kind of handkerchief panels coming down. So it actually looks like quite a long dress. But of course, as soon as she would start dancing, and back in the 20s, they'd be doing, you know, very energetic dancing where she would be turning and spinning, these would come flying up. And then, of course, what you're left with is something much, much shorter. And that was, a lot of girls would do that, you see, because they could get away with it. It wasn't until they actually started moving that the panels would come up, and suddenly their knee was visible. So she would walk down the aisle without a visible knee. But I love this because, you know, you don't often get white 1920s wedding dresses. If you do get them, they've either been altered or cut or been used for something else. And all 20s clothing is really difficult because it's usually so fragile that it just disintegrates over the years.
Is that 1920 or
1920, yeah. So 1920, 1820, they would have been wearing, you know, those wonderful Jane Austen type dresses and things like that. But why don't, you know, if anyone else has any questions, please, and then I'll, you know, kind of end because I know I'm talking too much here. But you know, the thing is that with each of these dresses in the book, you know, it was impossible to choose. I mean, really, it was impossible. And in the end, what happened was that I went through a lot of stories I had in my mind, and I really wanted to include them. And we wanted to have stories about Doris in there, especially how Doris and Howard met, things like that. But I also wanted to represent many of the different century, or the two different centuries, and also every decade. So that was a help in the beginning. And then we started going through the book of, you know, these books of stories and all the files. And I only got up to about, you know, letter L to do the first book. So now the second book is, you know, moving on. And there's so many fantastic stories that, you know, I didn't even know existed until I started working on the next bit. But everything here, you know, like I say, that the stories are sort of, they're poignant ones. And as a very naughty interviewer, when I was doing a live radio interview in Australia a little while ago, we were, you know, moving along beautifully, you know, no difficult questions. I was able to answer questions, you know, and suddenly he says to me, and it was national radio too, he suddenly said to me, Charlotte, you know, and looking at him, I'm thinking, uh-oh, here we go. He said, what really you have written is a book about sex. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what do I say? And I said, no, you know, you're taking this a little bit. And he's like, yes, but you're telling me that all these stories are about women and how they catch men. And I said, well, no, not quite, because of course we have lovely stories about Kate Ludwig, who was left at the altar the day before the wedding, and she prepared her whole trousseau. And we have, you know, sort of quirky stories like the lovely Kathleen story of her birth. So it wasn't all that, but I sort of got what he meant. But it was never. It's all about, I guess, the fact that most often our best dresses or our special dresses revolve around somebody loved, whether it's, you know, your daughter getting married, or whether you're getting married, or, you know, when you meet somebody or whatever. So, you know, I kind of weeded him off the word of, you know, sex and tried to turn it back into sort of, you know, a genteel time when, you know, whatever. But he was hooked onto that. So, you know, the idea is just looking at women's stories from all these different angles, and luckily they happen to be lovely stories. So, but anyway, any questions? I'd love to answer any questions you might have.
What's the earliest dress or item in your collection?
The earliest item is about 1720, and it's a lovely American embroidered handbag that obviously a child would have done. So that's the earliest piece. And that's something else too, that you know, the collection encompasses every single item you could ever imagine to be associated with a woman's wardrobe. So, and it's, you know, it's all the unglamorous things to all the glamorous things. And I also have children's clothing and men's clothing and a lot of sportswear. But the earliest piece, yes, I've got a dress that is dated back to about 1690, and it's a wedding dress. But because it's been altered so many times, there's only a small piece left, and that's the little yoke on the front that's actually the original 1690. So you can actually, well, you can if you wanted to, but I sort of don't count that anymore because it now looks more like a Victorian dress because of the way they've done it. So 1720 is the really earliest piece, and it goes up to 2009. And, you know, to keep the tax man happy, because I'm always writing off things that I buy, you know, some of the things that I bought here in New York already that are, you know, 2010, they're now part of the collection. So, you know, it keeps on going. So, yeah. Sorry?
How do you decide what to buy in 2010?
Oh, well, you know, I've decided that, because I got asked, you know, what type, do I wear new clothing or vintage clothing? And, you know, I never wore vintage clothing until I got Doris's collection. Because, you know, now vintage is something that is really okay, you know, and it's a fashion statement to wear vintage. Whereas, you know, even 10 years ago, it was secondhand clothing. And so now it's taken. So now what I do is I tend to stick with really top-end designer or couture. It doesn't have to have a label in it, but the way it's made, it just needs to be couture, whether it's designer or whether it's vintage or new. That's the only way I can do it now. Or, you know, I mean, I know a lot of people suggest that I go out and buy sort of things that come out, maybe something iconic to Gap or something, but, you know, so big, I just don't want to do that. I want to just keep it so that either it's absolutely superb construction or fabric, something really unusual with a fabric, or it's a top designer, because, you know, in the end, I'll just end up with, you know, 15,000 pieces. And I'm bad enough. Hi.
Do you know why this started with Doris?
I think it was Doris trying to break away a little bit, trying to rebel a little bit from, you know, the fact that she wasn't meant to be interested in fashion, just from her. And, you know, her mother was obviously very well dressed, but in a conservative way. And I think it was just Doris kind of just expressing herself. And I think she loved writing and she loved talking, so that's probably where I get that from. And she really enjoyed the fact that she could turn it into a bit of a story and be a bit theatrical. And so I think that's it. Just, you know, why we ever start anything, I guess, hobbies. And it was just a purely out of her own love of fashion and clothing. Hi.
Where and how do you keep the clothes?
Well, I had a slight panic because 3 days before I was supposed to come, I was told I had to leave the building where it's been stored for a number of years. And we sort of worked through that one. But at the moment, it's in Sydney. It's moved around a bit, but at the moment it's in Sydney. And what I'm trying to do now is get a permanent home for it, where I don't have the funding to do it as a museum does. But as long as you keep the room in which, you know, and this is even for, you know, just the odd bits and pieces you're trying to save. It just has to be a room that has a constant temperature, so air conditioned in the summer and heated in the winter, and free of humidity, because humidity is disastrous because you get a mold growing and you will never get rid of it. So I just keep it in a huge room. It's about half the size, or maybe, you know, 2/3 the size of this room. And anything that hangs on big racks like this. So I've, you know, thousands of dresses on racks. And then anything that's incredibly valuable or very fragile, it rests in huge textile boxes. But because the textile box cost me $140 each, and, you know, I already have about 46 of them, you know, I'm really trying to, and I pay for this myself at the moment, you know, I'm really trying to make sure that I keep everything safe, but, you know, within a budget, because I'd much rather be buying clothes than, you know, storing them very rude. So, yep, so it's just it's very well monitored, and I just ensure that there are no bugs and moths and things like that. But it's, you know, it's done DIY, amateurishly, with very much a professional knowledge, just wishing I could afford to do it that way. So, yeah. Hi. Sorry. Yeah.
How did your mom and Doris originally know each other?
My mother came over to America. She was a very good tennis player. So she went to America and was playing tennis in Bermuda. And her tennis companion at the time lived in near Westchester, Pennsylvania. So she actually moved to an area where Doris lived, and Doris took her under her wing. So my mother would have only been, she would have been young, you know, maybe 21, 22. And so she came over, and Doris took care of her. And then Doris and Howard met my father, and they introduced them. So that was how they did it. So it was Doris, you know, she always looked after people and, you know, made sure they felt at home. Sorry.
I was going to ask you about the green suit.
Yeah, the green suit, that's actually a lovely, it's absolutely beautiful. It's 1940s. It's a size 4, as you can see. And what's really lovely about it is that even though it was made during the war when everything was rationed, it looks very decadent with these sort of triple cuffs and the triple collar, but actually it was a very clever tailor who took scraps. And so when you look at the collar, it's not 3 collars, it's actually just little panels. And, you know, I use this when I talk to fashion students like Parsons, and I'm doing FIT next week, to say that, you know, you don't have to have excessive amounts of fabric and huge embellishment. With a little creativity and a very clever method of construction, you can create a really stunning outfit. But this one was worn by a woman called Mary Vining, who was the tutor to the Crown Prince in Japan. And Mary Vining was brought over to kind of give a bit of a Western education to this young prince. And you know, and what's so wonderful about this suit is I have the photograph of her wearing it, and her hair done up in this sort of plait that went around the top of her head. So it was a real article talking about Mary Vining and her role over in Japan, and how she would teach him English and she would play tennis with him and badminton and thing like that. And apparently the big thrill for the Crown Prince was the fact that Mary Vining taught him how to play Monopoly, and how, you know, they kept in touch. So, you know, so that all came out of the news clipping that I got. So that was a real genuine newspaper story that Doris had kept with all this. And so, you know, in the image, the illustration, we've done it exactly like the photograph. So that's that. Hi.
Do you have any of Jackie or Matt?
Well, funny enough, I don't know. But funny enough, I got an email today, I've been waiting for it for months, from a man in Melbourne who has a pair of her shoes. So he was contacting me about that. So, but no, it's funny, you know, anything now that's got a real kind of celebrity backing, like Princess Diana and people like that, you know, sadly they don't tend to be given. And if they go for sale, you know, it's way out of my budget. So, yeah. But I'd love to, you know, it's a lovely part of the American history. Yeah. Hi.
Do you have the articles organized according to year of when they were done, or by evening wear?
So the actual garments?
All the
Yeah.
collections. And then another question.
Yeah.
The garment that has the wool in it, would that have been worn in the wintertime, or would that have been worn in the spring?
Well, I've never been to Japan, but I think probably like,
The sequin.
Oh, the sequin one, this one here. I think it probably wouldn't have been worn any time. I mean, obviously not on a hot summer's night, but, you know, I think it probably was one of those dresses that if it were a bit cooler, like last night, you know, even though it's spring, you might have put that on instead of maybe a springy type dress. But, well, I started out having a wonderfully organized storeroom, so everything was organized, and I've had so much work and so much going on that it is chaos. So my dream is that what I probably do is, what I tend to do is I do have racks that are all little black dresses, racks that are only wedding dresses, things like that, all Victorian bodices. So eventually I will have them in date order in the categories, and certainly with my shoes and my hats, they go on shelves and they're all in decade order. Yeah, so that's my dream with work experience students. Hi.
Could you talk about that? I think it's a navy dress with lace on it.
Navy dress. This one? That one? Yeah. This one's lovely. This one's probably about 1930s. And this story is based around a woman by the name of Betty Herman. And she actually, you know, wore this dress. But the story is that you know, she felt she was a very proper woman. A lot of the women in these stories are very, very wealthy and, you know, have that kind of a lifestyle. But apparently Betty Herman's mother was a very proper woman, and she was appalled that when Betty was engaged, her boyfriend or her, you know, fiance would drive up tooting his horn as he came up the driveway and would expect her to run out and just jump in the car. And of course Betty Herman's mother thought, you know, my future son-in-law needs to park the car and come in and get her. And, you know, and apparently as the story goes, that not only did he toot the horn and she have to run out and get in the car, but on their wedding night, he had filled the car with bootleg whiskey and got caught. And so his wedding night was spent in prison. So it did not start well, but they lived very happily for many, many years. So, you know, again, it was just one little snippet of a story, and I do have a lot of Betty Herman's dresses, and they're all very glamorous. You know, very long, 1930s, very elegant. So, so that's that one. Anybody else? Or yeah?
Have you decided if the collection will stay in the family, or do you have other?
Well, I want the collection always to remain available and accessible, so I don't want to give it to another institution, because then I'll just be put in the vaults and they'll pull out the Dior's and the Chanel's and whatever, and you know, the rest of the pieces, which I find far more fascinating, will be left. But you know, I've got a 10-year-old daughter, and I know I would never ever, you know, start grooming her for it. You know, she wants to take it over, she can, but I think eventually it'll probably just become its own foundation in Australia, and it'll just be there for people to use. So.
Can you tell us about the peach
This one? Yeah, this is one of those intimate stories that I had to change the name of the woman, because it's all based around a woman who, during the war, and this is another thing. I mean, this is sort of a sex story for Alan Saunders, so, you know, I didn't mention it to him, but it never was mentioned in the book. But it's all based, apparently, she met this wonderful Frenchman who swept her off her feet, and he came from this really grand family. And so every time he'd come over, he'd bring her beautiful things. And again, you know, war, so it's a little bit of social history. You know, when things were being rationed in America, he was bringing her beautiful French lingerie and maybe silk stockings and things like that. And so they had this sort of wonderful love affair for a year or so. And then she didn't hear from him again, not for many, many, many years. And it turns out that he was Jewish and he had to escape. And so he was brought over to him. He was rescued by a woman, I'm not quite sure where she was from, but he was rescued by a woman who, you know, took care of him and looked after him and fell madly in love with him. But because he was still in love with this woman, Simone, in America, he said to his rescuer, you know, I don't love you, but I appreciate so much what you've done. So as my, you know, gesture of thanks, I will never get married. And so, so Simone, you know, she found that out later as to why, you know, and he kept in touch with her, but, you know, that was the end. So, you know, a little bit poignant, a bit bittersweet, but still a really beautiful story. And, you know, it was a bit more detailed in the letters, and that was one of the ones that I really thought that I'm sure she never planned. I'm sure she'd never told anybody this story, and I didn't want to break the news to her family, you know, that she had this incredible affair. So I kind of, you know, just kept it vague. But, you know, again, and what I say to people, even though the book is sort of fun and it's storytelling, it's still a very gentle sort of history and a lesson in social history, because, you know, all these things, you know, a lot of young people really don't realize the impact it had on fashion or why it made something so special. So that's it. Thank you.
One more dress.
Oh, see, I was trying to keep it short by not telling this one.
Yes.
Okay, well, this one is this is sort of, again, 1930s. And it's absolutely beautiful on, because it's got this wonderful kind of lace see-through back. And this was another dress where Doris came to my rescue. And I was invited, or I was another one of those brash moments where I decided I was going to go to this ball at Blenheim Palace in London. And I got, I had a blind date for the thing, which is always a bit of a worry. And Doris lent me a dress, and this was the dress because the ball was a black and white ball, so you had to wear either or, and it was very, very formal, and you had to follow protocol. And so I got to Claridge's, where we were told to meet to get onto these very swanky buses that were going to take us to the ball. And I got a message saying that my date was not coming. And so here I was going to this ball, I mean, really, really formal, with no date. And I just, I thought, what do I do? Do I get off the bus? And I happened, and again, this is, the right place at the right time. They had these sort of little booths on the bus. So my companions driving were the Maharaja of Jaipur and his wife. So I'm sitting off, and they were asking me where my date was, and I had to confess that it was a blind date, and it had all gone pear-shaped, and this, that, and the other. And so the Maharaja, who was absolutely charming, said, "Don't worry, I'll take care, I'll look after you all night." But I didn't realize quite how horrendous it was going to start off. So we get to the ball, we get to Blenheim Palace, and we get off the bus, and they trumpeted, the couples as they walked up the front steps. So, here I'm walking up praying, first of all, I don't fall over in my dress. And then when you got to the top, they ushered you through, I don't know if anyone's been to Blenheim Palace, but there's that wonderful room of armor to the left-hand side. So they ushered us through there, gave us, a flute of champagne, and then you walk through, and before I had a chance to run, what I found was that you got to the top of the formal steps inside the house, and then you had to, there would have been 9,000 steps that I had to walk down. And they had, the Duke and Duchess and all the grand people lining the steps, and, the rest of the party, which would have been hundreds of people with dates, were all standing below. And so the butler or whatever it was, he would stand there, and he'd be reading it because he had to give him your calling card. And so I handed my thing, and of course, I'd crossed out, I can't remember what my date was, Bob, I crossed out Bob so that all that was there was, Miss Charlotte Smith. And so he started reading, and, and you could see he got Miss Charlotte Smith, and he looked over and you could just see me standing there by himself, and he was not impressed, I can tell you, because this was just not what you did. And so he just said, and Miss Charlotte Smith, and I had to walk down those steps by myself. It was so awful. But I remember writing Doris, and I said, thank goodness I had that dress on, because, you know, I felt fantastic, and I borrowed a beautiful necklace from my mother. So I looked the part. But, of course, once I got over the horrible shock of having to do all this by myself, when I got down there, it was the best thing to be dateless, because, of course, all the men had, you know, tossed their wives to one side because they didn't want to dance. So I spent the whole night dancing, and it was the most fantastic occasion. So, yeah, so it was a great dress. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Charlotte, for your wonderful talk and for sharing your wonderful stories. We're all excited to read your book. And Barrett Bookstore is here selling books. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I would like to remind you of a program that we have coming up on Sunday. Our Spring Author Series continues. And Sunday at 5:30 p.m., we will have author Jonathan Ive, who wrote the book Capone, The Plot to Capture America's Most Wanted Gangster. So blood and guts and good stuff. So please join us on Sunday. Thank you again so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you. My wine. Great. Well,